Okay, we are connected, we are recording, and we are ready to go. Hi everybody again. This is the second of a four-part series, and next week we're going to be on location in the laboratory / factory of the Tekhelet, where we're going to actually see how we make Tekhelet. For those of you who ordered dye kits, you're going to be doing it together with us. I hope that'll be exciting and work. That's always a problem. And the week after that, the fourth lecture will be with Rabbi Moise Navon will be joining us, and he's going to be talking about some of the halachic implications, the Jewish legal implications of the rediscovery of Tekhelet. So we're going to dive right into it now. I want to do just a slight little bit of review. If you remember last week, previously on the quest for Tekhelet, we last left our hero, Rav Gershon Henoch Leiner, with Tekhelet that he had found in Naples, in the aquarium in Naples, and he believed that the chilazon, the source, the marine animal that was the source of the dye, he believed that that was the cuttlefish, also known as the inkfish, tincta fish, and the brown dye sepia that came out of the cuttlefish. Rav Gershon Henoch believed that that was the foundation or the chemical basis for Tekhelet, and afterwards, after a little bit of work, he had to turn that brown dye blue, but ultimately the sepia, the cuttlefish, was the chilazon, the source of the Tekhelet. That's what Rav Gershon Henoch believes, and we saw that last week that there were not many people other than Radzyn Chassidim, maybe Breslov Chassidim, that really accepted Rav Gershon Henoch's identification of the chilazon with the cuttlefish. And here I just found this week the sha'ar, the front page of one of the first editions of one of Rav Gershon Henoch's books. He wrote 3 books. The first before he went out on his search for the chilazon, and 2 afterwards, which were published posthumously. Rav Gershon Henoch died in 1891, and these were to counter arguments against his identification of the cuttlefish, and also to bolster the argument that the cuttlefish was indeed the chilazon. Okay, so if you remember, we asked 4 questions that I hope that we would try to answer in these series. The first was, what was Tekhelet, what is Tekhelet, and why was it or is it important to us? And we started talking about that a little bit last week, and we'll continue with that this week, and we'll continue over the next 2 weeks and 3 weeks, including today. The second question was, why was Tekhelet lost? How could it possibly be that such an important mitzvah, such an important commandment, but not only is it an important commandment, such an important item in all of the ancient world, how could it be that it was lost? And we talked about that also last week. And the third question was, why did it take so long to rediscover Tekhelet? That is what I hope to focus on today. How could it possibly be, with all of the advances in science and with everything that we know, and over the last 100, 200 years, we know so much about the natural world, and this couldn't have been such an amazing secret if you think about it. I mean, 4,000 years ago they were dying with Tekhelet. So how could it be that it took so long to rediscover Tekhelet? And that's really what I'm going to focus on today. And the last question, which we won't really get to today, what are some of the implications of Tekhelet, and we'll talk about that more next week and the week after. Okay. Well, the next person that I'd like to introduce you to is the great Rav Yitzchak Isaac Halevi Herzog. Rav Herzog was, I mean, words that come to mind when you talk about Rav Herzog, and I have to say, we're not going to do service to the greatness of this man, just such a giant, such a monumental figure in the 20th century Judaism. I could give a 4-part series just on Rav Herzog alone and his amazing accomplishments and his incredible, incredible life. Rav Herzog, words that come to mind are autodidact, right? He was taught he was taught by his father, Rav Yoel. Well, let's start with his biography. Rav Herzog was born in Lodz in Poland. His father, Yoel, moved to Leeds and became the rabbi in this town of Leeds, which was kind of a small town in England. A few years later, he moved to Paris, and Rav Yoel became the chief rabbi of the city of Paris. Rav Yoel was a great Talmudic scholar in his own right, and took upon himself the education, certainly the Torah religious education, of the young Yitzchak Isaac. So, essentially, Rav Herzog was completely homeschooled, not just in religious studies, but also in secular studies. Never stepped foot in his younger days in the yeshiva. There probably weren't so many where they were living, and certainly never in a secular school. Now, that didn't stop Rav Herzog from becoming extremely, extremely proficient, both in Torah and in secular studies. So Rav Herzog, by the time that he was 16 years old, was already recognized, even though he lived in these backwaters to a certain extent, not in the main centers of Talmudic discourse in Eastern Europe, right? But rather, in this kind of backwater in Leeds. But nonetheless, through correspondence, and often anonymous correspondence, Rav Herzog became known to the point where when he finally got smicha, he got smicha. He was ordained as a rabbi from 3 different people. He always considered Rav Yaakov David Wolofsky, the Ridvaz, who was one of the great Talmudic scholars of that generation. He always considered him his primary teacher, and later on he would actually name his son Yaakov after the Ridvaz. So the Ridvaz once said of the young Isaac Halevi Herzog that he was akin to Rabbi Akiva Eger in his generation. Now, for those of you who know the intricacies of Talmudic scholarship, and even for those who don't, that's no small compliment. Okay, really an amazing thing, certainly, to be said of such a young man. So Rav Herzog was a great Talmud scholar, but he was also, although homeschooled, and I would almost say self-taught, right? Especially in secular studies, that never stopped him from becoming really, really proficient in secular knowledge as well. And he received two masters from the Sorbonne, one in mathematics and one in classics. Okay, so you just get the spectrum of knowledge, of interests, mathematics and classics, Greek and Roman. And so Rav Herzog, in fact, he was once called a phenomenon of knowledge, which, again, I think that describes him. But I'm focusing too much on Rav Herzog as a man of learning. Rav Herzog was also a man of action. So he became the chief rabbi of Dublin and then of all of Ireland, took that post. And in 1936, when Rav Kook passed away, Rav Herzog became the chief rabbi of the British Mandate in Palestine in 1936, and he continued in that position through 1948 when he became the chief rabbi of the State of Israel, and all the way till his death in 1959. So Rav Herzog was the chief rabbi of Israel through that entire turbulent time, the foundations of the state, the Second World War, and he also was, to a certain extent, the chief rabbi of the world. And he took that position very, very seriously, with correspondence with everyone from all over the place. But he was especially a man of action. Rav Herzog met worked tirelessly, indefatigably for the Jewish people. He met with Roosevelt in the White House to try and convince him during the war, during the Second World War, to do more for the Jewish people. After the war, he had his famous trip throughout Europe to try and collect the remnants, the orphans that were still left in Christian houses and Christian monasteries and Christian churches and schools, and collected those Jews, those orphans, and brought them back. And just an amazing, amazing trip that he did, and worked tirelessly. And after this establishment of the State of Israel, he went back to America and met with Truman. And as Truman's biographer, Robert McCulloch, says, he actually, literally, brought Truman to tears, and moved him so much with his sincerity and his thanks for what Truman had done for the State of Israel. But for our purposes, and in this case, what really interests us about Rav Herzog is the fact that in 1914 he received a doctorate from the University of London, a doctorate on Hebrew Porphyrology. Now, for those of you who haven't heard the word Porphyrology, you can be forgiven because Rav Herzog invented it. Porphyrology means the study of purple. And so this is the cover page of one of the drafts of Rav Herzog's doctorate. And in it, he collected everything that was known up until that time about Tekhelet, and tried as best as he could to make sense out of what we knew, what we could know about Tekhelet. Could Tekhelet possibly be this or that creature, and what it was in ancient times, both from the religious standpoint, and this is a tour de force of essentially everything that is written in the sources about Tekhelet, in the Jewish sources and the religious sources. But then also, he, as you can imagine, Rav Herzog was also a man of science and a historian. Amazing what goes on in this doctorate in terms, even just in terms of the languages, right? You go through the doctorate, you'll find certainly Greek and Roman, of course, English and Hebrew, but you'll find Sanskrit. You'll find even a little bit of allusions to Chinese, German, French. Rav Herzog is really just an amazing. This doctorate is just a collection of so many different disciplines. It's hard to pigeonhole it into anything. It really is its own discipline almost. So before we get into the main thrust of what it is that Rav Herzog was trying to do in the doctorate, I want to focus on one part of the doctorate, which is Rav Herzog's attempt to understand the Radzyn Tekhelet from the Rabbi. Of course, the Rabbi had passed away long ago. This is almost 25 years after Gershon Henoch had died. But nonetheless, the tradition of dyeing Tekhelet still existed in Radzyn. And so Rav Herzog received some strings from the Radzyn dyers and sent them away for chemical analysis. And he sent them away to a number of different laboratories in England, in France, and in Germany. And in Germany, it was very interesting. The analysis came back from a professor, Paul Friedlander, who was, I guess at that point, the greatest scholar, the greatest chemical, the greatest chemist who knew the most about the ancient dyes in purple. He actually found the chemical properties of Tyrian purple, and was the first to really identify the structure of the molecule. In any event, Rav Herzog sent away the Radzyn Tekhelet, the strings, and expected to get back some sort of an analysis. Rav Herzog himself writes in his doctorate, we have the original doctorate that he writes, some of the drafts, but the book was republished in 1989, I think, as along with some interesting essays. Rav Herzog gets back this letter So let's take a look at the letter from Porphyrology. As far as the dyeing process from Radzyn is concerned, now get this. Well, what is lacking is the main thing, namely the dye stuff from which the wool is covered. And essentially, here says Porphyrology, the greatest chemist, the greatest dye chemist of the period, the details about the use of sepia officinalis are only misleading, and it is completely impossible with this substance to achieve that kind of coloring. Well, this is extremely difficult. What is going on here? Rav Herzog was completely puzzled, baffled. Porphyrology is saying that the blue strings that come from Radzyn, which the Radzyn Rebbe said came from the sepia, from the cuttlefish, Porphyrology is telling him that there is absolutely no way that they could have come from a cuttlefish. Well, so Rav Herzog sends away to the Goblins Institute, another very, very important chemical laboratory, and for another analysis. And look at this, what he gets back. Well, as far as the sepia is concerned, it yields brown and not blue. Okay, so what blue is this that are in the strings of the Radzyn Rebbe? So the Goblins chemists write back that, in fact, it has all the characteristics of Prussian blue. Prussian blue. Okay, well, this again is absolutely baffling. Prussian blue is a synthetic dye. And it was actually, Prussian blue was discovered in the 1700s, early 1700s, by a very colorful, excuse the pun, pair of scientists, Henri Lacaze-Duthiers and Konrad Dippel. You can find out more about them. I don't want to get into them, but suffice to say that they did some very interesting experimentation on dead bodies and lived in the castle that was the inspiration for Frankenstein. So they were quite interesting in their own rights. But they did discover this chemical compound, I should say, ferric ferrocyanide, and that is Prussian blue. So since the 1700s, it was known how to make this Prussian blue, and the Goblins Institute and Porphyrology are coming back and saying that, in fact, what the Rebbe has is this synthetic dye and not an organic dye. In other words, it didn't come from the cuttlefish. Well, how could that possibly be? So Rav Herzog sent away to the dye masters of Radzyn, and he asked if he could get their recipe for the dye that they were making. He could not believe that the Rebbe was fooling him. The Rebbe would never lie. The Rebbe would never trick anybody. So how could it be that he's making this blue dye that the chemists are saying is a synthetic dye and doesn't come from organic material, and certainly not from the sepia? Well, the dye masters wrote back, and this, I copied it for you. This is in the draft, one of the early drafts of Rav Herzog's doctorate, and you can actually see this is his own handwriting. So it kind of makes you, kind of gives you a little bit of an intimate, an intimate kind of introduction to Rav Herzog himself and a connection to him. So this is Rav Herzog writing what he received back as a letter from the Radzyn dye master, and this is somewhere around 1912. Okay, so the dye master writes that what we do, right? He says, Lodi, I want to tell you, right, that this Tekhelet hanimtzapo, right, this Tekhelet which is here that we make in Radzyn, metamtzit dam hachilazon ullo min seva zulato. Well, it comes from the chilazon, what they call the chilazon, this cuttlefish, right? And no other seva dye color has been added. And I says the dye master, I know this very well. I am the one who knows all of these samimanim, all of the chemicals, right, that are mixed with the blood of the chilazon. Nobody knows it better than I. And all of them, kihine kulam mishulale tseva umare kulam lavan. They're all white. They have no color. Now, what the dye master is stressing here is that the only place the dye color can come from, the blue, well, it can't come from any of the chemicals that we add. It can only come from the brown or black of the sepia, because all of the other chemicals have no color. Perfectly logical, right? And you want to stress this. The only one that has a color, right? Levad hadam, right? Dam hachilazon animsa betoch shalchofit. I think he means shalpuchit. The dam of the chilazon, the blood of the chilazon, which is in its sac, marehu shachor k'dio. It has the color as black as ink. The karush ad ki nishbar, and it is coagulated or dried out until it's very, very fragile and powdery. Okay, so makes sense. The only thing that has color is this dam chilazon, so therefore the color blue must come from the ink, from the liquid that they get out of the cuttlefish. Well. And then he says a couple of other things. We also add iron filings. And this is so beautiful and quaint. Right? V'gam sam lavan hanikra potash. We also add another chemical, which is white, right? And it's called potash. And then v'acharei hashaya betoch havarat eish gdola v'chazaka kishaot arba uchamisha. We leave it on a very, very, very large flame in this cauldron for 4 or 5 hours. Ad ki hatavera bo'eret chutza upnima, until this conflagration, this amazing fire, right, is burning inside and outside, ki isha shel gehenam, as the fires of hell themselves. And then the chemicals fuse together, the dye master goes on, and we get our blue dye. Well, this was enough for the Radzyn, for Rav Herzog to understand what was actually going on here in the cauldrons of the Radziner dyes. You see, at that high temperature, no organic molecules really maintain their structure, but rather they break down into their constituent atoms. Prussian blue is ferric ferrocyanide. The Fe comes from iron, so the iron filings gave the Fe to the Prussian blue that the Radziners add. And then they needed cyanide, which is Cn. So the nitrogen and carbon were given indeed by the cuttlefish dye. Because all organic molecules, most organic molecules have carbon and nitrogen in them. And essentially then, that's how this ferric ferrocyanide was created and the Prussian blue was created. But Rav Herzog says it could not possibly be that this was the source of ancient Tekhelet. Because why would the Talmud care so much that it had to come from a specific chilazon? All you need is the carbon and the nitrogen. And that can be delivered from anything. In fact, when Dippel and Diesbach did their work, they used ox blood. You could use gefilte fish. You could use chopped liver. You could use anything, essentially, that is organic. And at that high temperature, 800-900 degrees, everything is going to break down and recombine in a completely different way. And Rav Herzog says, therefore, the Radzyn dye, as Rav Herzog says it, stands self-condemned because there is no way, essentially the cuttlefish plays no part in this dye. And that was, to a great extent, the end of the story at least from a scientific standpoint, as far as the Radzyn Tekhelet is concerned. But I do want to point out one beautiful, beautiful footnote, really, to this. Radzyn Tekhelet lasted until Rav Gershon Henoch's his grandson, Rav Shmuel Shlomo Leiner, affectionately known as Rav Shmelkele Radziner. He was killed in the Holocaust, and the story of the Radziner, the last of the direct Radziner dynasties, is told within Radzin and out of Radzin, and poems that were written about it and songs. Shmelkele told all of his students at some point, his Hasidim, that they should join the partisans and they should fight the Nazis. He was taken away, and the story is a lot more complicated, but we don't have time to get into it now. He was taken away by the Gestapo and killed. As he was taken into the cemetery, he went through the gate of the cemetery, and the Nazi officer pushed him. Shmelkele turned around to the Nazi officer and spit in his face. He was wearing the talis of his grandfather with the Tekhelet that the Radziner found, and the first of the strings that were ever made of the Radzyn Tekhelet. There, the Nazi Gestapo officer shot him dead, fell to the floor of Shmelkele, blood mingling with the strings of the Tekhelet that his grandfather had made. It's a chilling, chilling scene to picture. But that's not the end of the story, because as the Jews of Radzin, the few survivors, made it back, or made it to the state of Israel after the war, they had forgotten how to make Tekhelet. The Tekhelet recipe was lost in the ashes of Radzin, and nobody knew, nobody remembered. But some people recalled that Rev Herzog, now Chief Rabbi of Israel, had done work on the Tekhelet, and the surviving Hasidim asked Rev Herzog if he would share with them the recipe that he had gotten in 1912, way before the war, from the Radziner dye masters. And here I collected some letters of Rev Herzog from his archive, where he invites people. The letter in the middle is an invitation to Professor Yeshaya Leibovitz, for any of you who have come across that name, a great, not only a professor of science, but also a professor of Jewish philosophy, Jewish history. And he invites in 1950, when is this, 57? 53. Anyway, Rav Herzog invites a number of people to join him for Radzin dyeing. Rav Herzog shared with the Radziner Hasidim that made it to Israel after the war the recipe that he had gotten from the Radzin dye masters, and said, I give testimony that this is indeed the recipe that I got from Radzin. I don't believe that this is true Tekhelet, but I do give testimony that this indeed was the recipe that the Radziners used to make Tekhelet. And Radzyn Tekhelet still to this day is dyed. Thousands, tens of thousands of people who are associated with Radzin and other Hasidic sects still wear Radzyn Tekhelet. Again, Rav Herzog is responsible both for disproving the authenticity of Radzyn Tekhelet, and at the same time saving Radzyn Tekhelet from being lost completely to history. An amazing, amazing man. Back to Rav Herzog, and now we're going to take a little bit of an understanding, and I'm going to be a little bit free, not necessarily stick directly to Rav Herzog's doctorate, but I'll stay within, I think, to a very close to a very close understanding of what he meant and what he was getting at, because I may add some things that were not necessarily available to Rav Herzog in 1914, but nonetheless they're in the spirit of what he's saying. So, okay. we're going to find here a logical difficulty. And it starts with the assumption for the color of Tekhelet. The first thing that we have to say is, what is indeed the color of Tekhelet? Well, we have our own sources. Rabbi Meir Omer, Ma nishtana Tekhelet mikol hatzivoni mipnei sheTekhelet domer liyam v'yam domer lirakia. Tekhelet, Rabbi Meir asks the question, why is Tekhelet so important? Why is it so beautiful? Why is it so special amongst all of the different colors? Well, because Tekhelet is similar to the sea, and the sea is similar to the sky, and I guess that would put it squarely in the blue regime, in the spectrum of blue. A little darker, a little bit lighter, but this is one of the earliest known sources for the color of Tekhelet. Remember, the Torah never tells us, the Bible, and all of the 49 times that Tekhelet is mentioned, never tells us what color Tekhelet was. So, well, there are other opinions. There's an opinion by Rashi who uses the word green. There's an opinion that it may be very, very dark blue, midnight blue, darshan, which is also brought down by Rashi. There are also potential candidates, maybe purple, but the predominant opinion within Jewish legal sources, and I would say Jewish sources in a very, very wide sense, is that Tekhelet is blue. And that's the assumption that we're going to make. Now look at the Rambam. The Rambam, Maimonides, says it absolutely without any way that you could read anything else into it. It's Demut Harakia, Hanir'eit La'ein Hashemesh B'toharo Shel Rakia. It is the color of the sky, which is, when you look at the sky in the middle of the day, close to the sun, that in a perfectly clear sky, I mean, you can't say it any more precisely than that. And the Rambam is, of course, the greatest of all Jewish legalists. And so this is the opinion that was taken by the two or maybe even three fundamental researchers in Tekhelet through the last, let's say, 150 to 170 years. That's the opinion of the Radzyn Recipe, that Tekhelet has to be sky blue. Before him, the Tiferet Yisrael, we saw Lifshitz, who also wrote about Tekhelet, made it clear that Tekhelet had to be the color sky blue, and so Rabbi Herzog absolutely says the Tekhelet that we are looking for has to be sky blue. Okay. Now, let me say that Rabbi Herzog is not only leaning on these sources, let's say Maimonides or Rabbi Meir, which is brought down in the Talmud and the Medrash. There are other reasons to believe that Tekhelet is blue from external sources. Here's one such example, and there are many, but this is one. What you see here is a cuneiform tablet, and it's found in the British Museum, and it's a recipe for the dyeing of Tekhelet. In cuneiform, for anybody out there who reads cuneiform, you'll recognize this as the word takiltu, Tekhelet. In fact, the word Tekhelet predates the written Bible. The first time that we have any mention of the word Tekhelet is in the Tel Amarna letters from the 1400, 1500 BCE, around the time of Abraham. And so this word takiltu, now, it's a little bit tricky, and I have to say that I'm relying here on a friend and colleague, Professor Wayne Horowitz, who's an Assyriologist, one of the great Assyriologists at Hebrew University and really world-renowned, and he's the one who explained this to me. But the way the cuneiform works, it was originally an alphabet that was used for Sumerian. And we don't know Sumerian. We don't understand that language very well. But the same words afterwards were transferred to the Semitic language of Akkadian. So bear with me for a second. It was a kind of a picture language. So imagine that you had a picture language that represented a box, right? A box. And the word that represented as a picture for box was said, let's say in English, it was pronounced box. But let's say you moved now to Israel. The same representation of that idea, box, would now be pronounced red, kufsa. Okay, so it's a little bit tricky, but that's what happened when the same language, cuneiform, the written language, was transferred from Sumerian to Akkadian, the Semitic language. The word for Tekhelet, takiltu, in Akkadian, was represented by this picture, and the picture that in the ancient Sumerians and Akkadians and Assyrians did not have a word for blue. So the way that this picture was, what it meant originally was lapis lazuli-like color. Lapis lazuli is rock. It's a blue rock that you can see here. The lapis lazuli-like color is represented by the word takiltu. Put it all together, it's a little bit tricky, but at the end of the day, what you get is that the word takiltu meant the color of the rock, the gem, lapis lazuli. So that's another indication, nothing to do with Jewish sources, that Tekhelet meant a blue color. And one more thing that I want to put out there, and this is going to be very important. In the Talmudic times, and Rav Herzog talks about this at great length, in Talmudic times, you had a fraudulent dye that was used in place of Tekhelet. It looked exactly like Tekhelet. No one could tell the difference. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ani hu she'atid vipara mimi shetolek kala Ilan bevigdo ve'omer Tekheleti. God says, I shall exact judgment on those who wear kala Ilan, this fraudulent Tekhelet, and say that it is Tekhelet. In other words, only God can tell the difference between fake kala Ilan and authentic, real Tekhelet. They looked exactly alike. Well, kala Ilan is indigo, and we know this from many, many sources, but I just brought down here the Baruch, which is a very, very early dictionary from late Gaonic times. Perush kala Ilan, Perush min seva Tekhelet shekorin oto belaz indigo. Indigo. Well, indigo comes from a plant. It comes from a number of different sources. There are almost 300 different species that can give indigo, but the two that are most popular, most used, are the indigofera. That's this plant, and that's found throughout India and China, and for thousands and thousands of years it was used to dye indigo. And in fact, indigo is called indigo because it came to, let's say, the Western world from India, and that's why it got the name indigo. Then there's also the woad plant, isatis, and actually the Talmud and the Mishnah talk about another fake Tekhelet, or another thing which is used to make kala Ilan, and they call it isatis. So it's absolutely clear, I think, that indigo, kala Ilan, they are identical. Well, that means if only God can tell the difference between indigo and real Tekhelet, well, that means that they have to look alike. And so indigo, which we all know is the color of jeans, indigo is the color of Tekhelet. And so that is another indication, again, a logical indication, not necessarily directly from our sources, but kind of, you know, in a little bit of a roundabout way. Nonetheless, an absolute identification for the color of Tekhelet. Not everybody accepts this, but I think that this was enough. These different sources were certainly enough. And as I said before, the three fundamental pillars of Tekhelet research, Rav Yisrael Lifshitz, Titzeret Yisrael, Radzyn Recipe, and Rav Herzog, all of them absolutely agree that Tekhelet had to be blue. Just one little point here. Where does the word kala Ilan come from? So Ilan is a plant, and maybe it had something to do with kala Ilan. There were all kinds of suggestions, and there are all kinds of suggestions. One of the most interesting, I think, and innovative, radical even, was Rav Herzog himself, who suggested that kala Ilan came from the Chinese word for indigo. And that symbol that you have here is still used to this day. It's a picture of someone looking in as a reflection in a pot of water. That's what the pictograph seems to indicate, and maybe the reflection of the sky, perhaps. But anyway, this symbol, which is still used today for indigo, is pronounced in ancient Chinese as Ilan. So perhaps Kal Ilan comes from that, and that's Rav Herzog's suggestion. Again, absolutely brilliant idea that Rav Herzog put together. Well, okay. So I hope that I've put in your minds this idea that Tekhelet, the color of Tekhelet according to the Jewish tradition, is blue. As Rav Herzog said, for 1,000 years, Jewish children translated the word Tekhelet as Himmelblau, sky blue. And that, to me, said Rav Herzog, is enough of a tradition for me not to go against that. Where does Tekhelet come from? Okay, so first of the three premises that I'm going to put forth are that Tekhelet is blue. Here comes the second one. We remember this slide, if you do, that Tekhelet comes from the Mediterranean basin. Well, in the mid-1800s, an amazing discovery was made by a scientist, a naturalist by the name of Henri Lacaze-Duthiers. On a boat off the coast, he was on an expedition to find different species of life in the Mediterranean. And the great naturalist Henri Lacaze-Duthiers was on the boat, a fisherman, Majorca we're talking about, right, off the coast of Spain. And a fisherman breaks open a snail that he found in the sea, and he smears it on his shirt, and the yellow stain in the bright Mediterranean sun turns a beautiful shade of purple. And the fisherman said, "Aha, my great naturalist, my great scientist, I bet you've never seen that." So Lacaze-Duthiers looks at him and says, "Aha, you have just figured out the riddle of what the ancient Tyrian purple was." And Lacaze-Duthiers spent a number of years studying the marine species and especially the snails, and discovered three types of snails that are found in the Mediterranean. Murex brandaris and Theoshemastoma. They give a dark reddish purple, and Murex trunculus, which Lacaze-Duthiers found, gives a bluish purple. "Aha," said Lacaze-Duthiers, "I have discovered the riddle of the ancients. Brandaris and Hemastoma are the source of argaman, of the Tyrian purple, and the source of Tekhelet is the Murex trunculus, giving this blue purple." Well, a blue purple is precisely what these snails indeed give. And I hope that you'll be able to see this here. I don't know if you'll be able to see it very well. This is a piece of wool that is dyed with a Murex trunculus, and it is a beautiful, beautiful bluish purple. I would say almost a classic purple. This is what the Murex trunculus gives when you dye with it. Okay, well, you would imagine that that this should really solve the problem, right? The Murex trunculus giving this violet dye, purplish dye. No. We have a problem here, don't we? But it's not that simple to just dismiss it, because the Murex is really a fascinating little creature. And you know, when the Talmud says Chilazon gufo domer liyam, it looks like the sea. Well, the coating on top of these Murex shells, they look exactly like the color of the sea around them. And the way that that we interpret this idea, the Murex looks like the sea, or the Chilazon looks like the background of the sea. And in fact, the Radzyn Rebbe also, even though he was talking about a cuttlefish, he also accepted that understanding of this Breita, that it looked like the sea. So this is something that makes you think that that you don't want to dismiss the Murex out of hand. It's true that it gives a purple dye that's not exactly blue, but maybe we should at least consider the Murex a little bit more deeply. And it gets a little bit more interesting when you start to look at the archaeological evidence here, because you've got, for thousands of years, and from so many different regions, you have the indication that the Murex was used as the source of the dyes. From Tyre, where we have a coin with pictures of the Murex on it, you can actually see it here. Jerba, right, off the coast of Morocco, you have pools that had crushed Murex in them, so it was clear that they were doing dyeing with Murex. In Rome, remember last week we saw the Roman coins minted with the Murex between the talons here of the eagle. On the island of Crete, you have crushed shells of Murex. In Sidon, in Lebanon, in Tel Dor and Sarepta in northern Israel, mounds of crushed Murex and dye installations with Murex in them. And I think something which is absolutely has to be addressed. And that's what I have here in the middle. This is a find from Har Zion in Jerusalem, Mount Zion in Jerusalem. A few dozen Murex snail shells are found dated to the Second Temple period in the very houses that the priests, that the Kohanim lived in while they were working and serving in the temple. What are they doing with Murex shells? What are they doing with Murex shells? They live in the ocean. They're 100 kilometers away from the ocean and all the way up a mountain. So what are you doing with these shells if not for the fact that there was something going on with Murex that was related to the temple, namely the Tekhelet dyeing? Okay. Well, there basically you have it. And the issue is as follows. There are three premises here that I'm going to put forth. Three statements. Number one, Tekhelet is blue, sky blue. Number two, the source of the Tekhelet is the Murex. And number three, Murex dyes purple. Those three statements cannot all be true. Well, is it really true that Murex dyes purple? Is there nothing else that we can know about? Let's look back to what Rav Herzog saw in these letters. Remember, I showed you this exact slide, but right now I'm going to highlight different words in the letters that Rav Herzog got back. He sent the letters, if you recall, to Friedlander and to the Goblin Institute. He sent them to find out about Radzyn Tekhelet. But there's something else that's written in these letters that Rav Herzog took note of. Look at this. Paul Friedlander, the greatest chemist of his time, writes, I also consider it impossible to produce a pure blue from the purple snails that are known to me. Murex snails produce a purple dye. And so too the French chemists. I don't know of any natural blue color other than indigo that is capable of solidly dyeing textile fabrics. Indigo from the plant, that's the only dye known to science at Rav Herzog's time that can give a blue dye. I'm not talking about synthetic dyes that are made in the lab and Perkins and everything that happened in the late 1800s. But for natural dyes, the only source of a fast natural blue dye that was known to science in ancient times, but at least certainly now, with Herzog, 1914, the only dye comes from the indigo plant. Murex snails dye purple. And just to drive this point home, I'd like to introduce you to Rav Chaim Torsky from Chicago, who's going to tell us his story, and this story is from 1978.
I looked through it, and indeed, it was very impressive. I said to myself, that was nearly a century ago. This is 1978, so this is 1880-something, 1887, I believe. Let's see if something else hasn't been discovered in the meantime. So I sat down and I wrote a few letters to various institutions. I got back some responses. One, the letter from the Smithsonian said, we think we have the answer. It was Murex. However, the letter wrote, the dye that you get will be purple, not blue. So I thought, well, very nice. You got something for argument with you.
Okay. Rabbi Twersky in 1978 writes to the Smithsonian Institute and some other people, and as far as they knew, there is no source that can give you a blue dye from a marine animal. The only thing that these purple snails can give you is indeed purple, what we call purple today. And so we are now left, as far as Herzog is concerned, but up until 1978-79, the position of all scientists in the world is that snails from the marine snails from the Mediterranean give you purple dye. Nonetheless, they believed that that was the source of ancient Tekhelet because they were willing to forego the first premise that we had, that Tekhelet was blue. They believed, scientists, archaeologists, historians believed, Tekhelet must be violet, a blue-purple, but some sort of a purple tint. Rav Herzog was never able to deal with this and do away with this conundrum that he was left with, this puzzle, this riddle. He did believe that Tekhelet came from a sea snail, from the Mediterranean, absolutely, and he leaned in his doctorate towards the Murex trunculus as the source of the Tekhelet, and that because of all of the archaeological evidence and linguistic evidence and other evidence that he had. So Rav Herzog believes, or would like to believe, that the Murex trunculus was the source of ancient Tekhelet, was the Chilazon. He also was completely convinced that the traditional attitudes towards Tekhelet, the color had to be blue, sky blue. But what to do? Because these snails, the Murex snails, produced purple and not blue. He wasn't willing to give up on the Murex snail. He certainly wasn't willing to dismiss all of scientific understanding and knowledge at that point. Herzog was also a man of science. Yet, he wasn't willing to give up on the tradition that Tekhelet was blue, and so Herzog in 1959, when he passed away, was never able to solve this problem. The solution would come, but not for another 25 years after Herzog's death, in 1985, but that is a story for next week. I'm leaving you with this one other word before we finish. Okay, purple or blue? Assuming again, like what Herzog did, and like really almost all classical sources believe, within Judaism, the Tekhelet was a blue color. And we know that Tekhelet was the most desired and the most precious of all of the dyes, at least as far as the Jews were concerned, and we saw that last week in the list of precious materials. Tekhelet always comes first. Tekhelet, the blue string on our tzitzit, and Tekhelet, the blue that the Kohen Gadol wore. That was the most precious color to the Jewish people, but not to the rest of the world. In fact, the rest of the world actually prized purple above blue. And you can look here, for example, at Pliny the Elder. He writes, "It brightens every garment and shares with gold the glory of the triumph. For these reasons we must pardon the mad desire for purple." The toga picti, which was the highest form of status, the greatest thing that anybody could wear, reserved only for the triumphant general in ancient Rome, returning from battle, a purple toga lined with gold. Purple was blue. It was also very, very precious and beautiful. We saw that Justinian outlawed the use of purple, of blue as well. But purple was the highest in the hierarchy of colors and fabrics, but not to the Jew. To the Jews, blue was more precious and more exalted than purple. I have here a fantastic quote from Yossi ben Yossi, who lives in the 4th century in Eretz Yisrael, when Tekhelet still existed. Remember, we saw that in the 7th century, Tekhelet was lost. Yossi ben Yossi, the great Paitan, the great poet, wrote about Tekhelet in one of his piyutim, in one of his poems about the Kohen, about the Kohen and about the service of, in the temple, especially on Yom Kippur. And he writes, Atui me'il Tekhelet kizoar harakia. And by the way, I think this is a very, very important quote. Atui me'il Tekhelet, the Kohen, the high priest, was adorned with the robe of Tekhelet, kizoar harakia, like the brilliance of the sky. 4th century Israel, a man who saw Tekhelet, is writing down, this is the color of Tekhelet, and he's comparing it to the brilliance of the sky. I think this is an absolute indication for the color of Tekhelet given by an eyewitness. But why is it, and that's what I'd like to take the last minute or two and try to understand. Why is it that the rest of the world prized purple, or I should say, why is it that the Jews prized blue above all other colors? Well, maybe it has to do with a certain, maybe even emotional reaction that people have to blue. And I'd like to quote from the great artist Kandinsky. Vasily Kandinsky writes, and just to give you an understanding, Kandinsky had a very, very special relationship with colors. I would say almost unique. He had a neurological condition called synesthesia, where he heard colors. Colors, to Kandinsky, not only could he see them, but he could hear them. They had a musical tone to them. Pictures were like symphonies to him. And Kandinsky writes specifically about blue, the deeper the blue becomes, the more strongly it calls man towards the infinite, awakening in him a desire for the pure and finally for the supernatural. Kandinsky tapped into something that I think the ancient Jews understood, and the Torah promoted this idea. If you're a Jew and the rest of the world is pagan, pagans are looking to have a constraining relationship with God. This is the God of fertility. This is what I have to do in order to get the blessings of this God or to have the God on my side. The Jewish God is infinite. Infinite in all ways. Infinitely powerful. Infinitely knowing. Infinite in time and in space. But how is it even possible then to have a relationship? Va'anochi afar va'efer, says Abraham when he speaks to God. Here I am standing in front of you and I'm nothing. I am but dirt and ashes, dust. Nonetheless, here he is speaking to God. How can a Jew attempt even to have a relationship with an infinite God? Well, the answer is, I believe this to be true, and I think that you can find this in the Meshech Chochmah as well. The reason why a Jew can have a relationship with the infinite God, we believe in imitatio Dei. We have to imitate God. Mahu rachum, just like God is merciful, so we should be merciful, right? Just like God is infinite, we should also be infinite, and we are also infinite. What does that mean? It means that we think to ourselves, and so much of our frustration in life comes from these constraints that we have. I can never do that, we say to ourselves. I can never do that because I'm not that kind of person. I'm not good at math. I'm not good at languages. I can never learn that. I could never accomplish that. But you know, these constraints, these walls, very often they're in our minds. They're our own self-imposed constraints. And if we could just learn to break through those, to do things that we thought we could never do before, well, that essentially makes us infinite. Every day we can grow. Every day we can go beyond. The message that the Tekhelet gives us is that you can go, as I mentioned last week to a certain extent. You have your own garment, but at the edge, at the very edge of the garment, where it's the end, you can't go any further. Or at least you think you can't go any further. The Tekhelet breaks through that and says, no, 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 more. You can do more. You can be more. You can do all kinds of things that you thought you couldn't do. In fact, as Herzog said, if you dream it, it can become a reality. There's nothing that can stop a person from accomplishing things that they never thought they could. What the blue signified, the infinite sky beyond our reach, the infinite sea that we can't fathom. What this meant to the Jew is that we can push ourselves into that infinity, and by being infinite, by breaking through our barriers day after day after day, by doing things that we thought we could never do, if we can become infinite, then we can have a relationship with that infinite God as well. And I think that that's what Kandinsky was touching on, and I do believe that that's what the Tekhelet signified in biblical times to the Jew, and hopefully today in our times as well. Next week, you'll join me, I hope, in the laboratory, and I'm going to stay on a little bit longer. I hope everybody enjoyed this. I'm going to stop recording now, and I'm going to stay on a little bit longer. If anybody has any kinds of questions, I'll continue and look to answer them. Stop.